So good to see everyone. My name is Victor Sines. I'm Executive Director of the Houston Institute and a lecturer here at Rice University. And I'm delighted to be co-hosting tonight's event with the Rice's Catholic Student Association and with Father Tucker here. And great to see so many of you here. Before I get started, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about our work here at Houston Institute. So Houston Institute is an academic nonprofit, and its mission is to help the people of Rice think deeply about the best way to live through the study of the liberal arts, especially philosophy and literature. We aspire to create a culture of intellectual friendship centered around robust conversations of what is true, good, and beautiful. Our work is animated by three main ideas that I summarize as great books, civil discourse, and human flourishing. Great books. So we believe that young people need to be exposed to the best authors on questions of meaning and value, thinkers like Plato, Virgil, and Homer, Augustine, Descartes, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, and so many others, including the best thinkers of today. Some of these are thinkers that I largely agree with, others are thinkers that I disagree with profoundly. But all of them are thinkers that have something important to learn from me. Second, civil discourse. We recognize that young people, and really all of us, are having a hard time having moral conversations across ideological lines and with those they disagree with. Think especially about conversations where people disagree about some of their deepest convictions and identity-forming beliefs. We want to be the place where those conversations happen. And finally, human flourishing. We're of the conviction that we should be talking more about what it means to flourish as human beings, about character, about virtue and vice, and that thinkers like Aristotle and Aquinas have enduring insights for us today. We run about 50 or so events a year, usually over a meal, and we also run several events for members of the broader community. And as you can imagine, our student audience is quite diverse ideologically. So we've got liberals, conservatives, atheists, traditionally religious people, but what brings us together is the conviction that thinking deeply about the best way to live matters. Of course, given our interest in questions of virtue and human flourishing, and especially the perspective of Aquinas, it's a particular privilege to be hosting Professor Eleonore Stump, whose philosophical work has been an inspiration for me for many years. And as I got to know Father Tucker some years ago, it soon became apparent not only that he also shared his admiration for Professor Stump's work, but that he knew her personally. So we got to working together on this event, which we've been working hard on and are very excited about. Of course, as is customary for HI events, I know that many of you here have different faith convictions or no faith convictions at all. And you can expect what you've come to know and love about HI, which is great conversation and great ideas. So let me hand it off to Father Tucker.
All right, good evening. I am Father Tucker. I'm with the Catholic Students Association and the Catholic Student Center in St. Mary's Chapel. And it is my absolute pleasure to be able to introduce to you Professor Eleonore Stump, who honestly needs no introduction, but I'm still going to give you one. Dr. Stump is the Robert J. Henle S.J. Professor of Philosophy at St. Louis University, and one of the most distinguished contemporary philosophers working in philosophy of religion, medieval philosophy, and metaphysics. Her work engages deeply with the thought of Thomas Aquinas while bringing those ideas into conversation with contemporary philosophical questions. She is the author of several influential books, articles, so many works. To name a few, includes Aquinas, Wandering in Darkness, Narrative and the Problem of Suffering, and Atonement. Works that have shaped ongoing discussions about suffering, divine love, and the nature of human flourishing. And on a little bit of a personal note, I actually don't know if you remember the first time that we met one another, but Dr. Stump actually had this wonderful habit of going and visiting some of the Jesuits who lived and studied philosophy at St. Louis University. She would come in, have dinner with us, and be able to have different conversations. I think I had just begun, and I was still very nervous about my philosophical background. And I happened to be sitting at table with Dr. Stump. And as soon as we sat down, she turned to everybody and said, "What are your questions?" It was wonderful. It was a little intimidating, I'm going to tell you. I don't know if I had any because all of a sudden every thought in my head went away. But So many of the other students there who had worked with Dr. Stump before began into these wonderful questions, thoughtful questions. And with every single one of them, you could see the delight of Dr. Stump. One, in helping to formulate questions. That's actually a great specialty of hers. Not just answering questions, helping to formulate good questions. But then her delight as well to be able to help her students to dig into those questions themselves. She is a gifted intellect, but I think more than that, she is a very gifted teacher and professor. And so it is my absolute honor to be able to introduce to you our speaker for the evening, Dr. Eleonore Stump.
So I'm grateful for the invitation to be with you today. I think highly of your community, your student body. I'm also a special fan of Father Tucker's. What he didn't tell you was that he was the associate pastor for a year at the big university church where many faculty go, and he was an absolute astonishment as an associate pastor. People loved him, and I was one of them. So, as a fan of his, I'm very pleased to be part of your community for this lecture. And I want to begin by saying, as the news of the recent weeks and months has made us all aware, we live in times of sorrow and suffering for very many people. And so, in my short lecture today, I'm going to talk about what it is to flourish as a human person, even in the midst of suffering. So just reassure me, can you see my disability rights movement slide?
Yeah.
Okay. The disability rights movement has made us all conscious about our contemporary attitudes toward suffering. Although we sometimes praise a person who suffers for not sinking under his suffering, we still tend to suppose that the sufferer is to be ranked more among life's losers than among life's winners. Even if we think of a person who stands under his suffering as heroic, we tend to think of whatever is good in his life as happening in spite of the suffering. And in general, we are inclined to find perverse anything that values the suffering itself. On the contrary, anything that undermines physical or mental thriving strikes us as lamentable. But it is worth noting that the current disability rights movement wants to call this general attitude into question. The disability rights movement wants to celebrate what others have generally pitied or disrespected as the suffering of misfortune. It wants others to see that those with disabilities are not among life's losers, or even among life's heroic overcomers of the tragic. Instead, the disability rights movement holds disability pride parades. Here's an excerpt from a text by Sarah Triano, the founder of the Chicago Disability Pride Parade. Here's what she says. The sad sack, the brave overcomer, and the incapable are worn-out stereotypes the parade refutes by giving us a time and space to celebrate ourselves as we are. First, we want to show others, we want to show others that there is an incredible joy that exists in our lives. We are part of the richness, we are part of the diversity of this country and the world. The parade is an international celebration of our continued and continuing survival. By marching in this parade, we are giving the world a chance to express pride in us too. From the patristic period onward, the Christian tradition has held a roughly analogous position, not as regards disability, but rather as regards suffering in general. It has supposed that those who endure serious suffering are not the pitiable losers of life, or even the heroic overcomers of tragedy, but rather are those who are specially loved by God. That is because, on this view, suffering is not only medicinal for the human condition, but is also a gift of God's to those who are nearer to God. The great patristic author John Chrysostom says of people who are scandalized at the sight of human suffering, he says, those scandalized people don't know that to have these sufferings is the privilege of those especially dear to God. Now, clearly, there is something certainly right about the contemporary unreflective rejection of suffering as bad. Someone who valued suffering as an intrinsic good would be mentally disturbed at best and wicked at worst. But there is nonetheless something worth exploring in the Christian attitude towards suffering as a gift, as represented in that quotation from Chrysostom. In this lecture, I want to look closely at the relevant Christian doctrines to see what can be said to explain this attitude towards suffering and to distinguish it from the neighboring perverse attitude that sees suffering as an intrinsic good. There is a biblical text in 2 Corinthians that expresses the relevant Christian attitude in a paradigmatic way, and it will be helpful to approach the examination of suffering through the claims in that text. In 2 Corinthians, Paul makes this claim: as the sufferings of Christ abound in us, so also our consolations abound through Christ. According to that claim, for a suffering person in grace in this life, her suffering is somehow correlated with the consolation she has in or with Christ. The comfort and help a sufferer has from Christ can intensify as her suffering increases. Later in the same epistle, Paul says, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, we are all changed into the same image from glory into glory through the Spirit, the Lord. And Paul goes on to connect the glory of that union with suffering in this way. He says, our light afflictions, which last only for a moment, bring about for us a far greater eternal weight of glory. In other words, according to Paul in this epistle, the suffering endured by a person in grace is one source of that person's glory or spiritual loveliness. And Paul's thought in this epistle, something about suffering, which seems to deprive a person of flourishing, actually enables or enhances the flourishing of the sufferer. To begin to understand this complicated thought about suffering, consolation, and glory, it's necessary to work slowly through its elements, beginning with the nature of human flourishing. Although discussions of human flourishing are by now something of a cottage industry, for my purposes here, a person's flourishing can be thought of as his thriving. So understood, the opposite of thriving is not being sick. The opposite of thriving is something like being dysfunctional. The failure to thrive is a broad category that encompasses any kind of impairment or impediment to the proper functioning of some part of a person, or even to the whole person herself. Thought of in this way, it's evident that thriving comes in different modes. To begin with, we can distinguish the thriving a person has when he suffers no impediments as regards his body from the thriving he has when he suffers no impediments as regards his mind. We can think of thriving, that is, either as bodily thriving or as thriving of the mind. And it's possible to have one of these modes of thriving without the other one. So, for example, there are people who are in excellent bodily condition, but who suffer from mental illness or some other impediment of mind. Buzz Aldrin was in peak athletic condition when he flew to the moon in 1969, but he later acknowledged that he also suffered from serious depression. On the other hand, clearly it's possible to have great bodily impediments, but to be thriving in mind. Harriet McBride Johnson is an example. She was a highly accomplished, highly intelligent disability rights activist, but she had serious bodily impairments. In her New York Times Magazine article describing her extended arguments with Peter Singer, a Princeton philosopher who advocates preventing the birth of people with disabilities, Harriet McBride Johnson describes herself this way. She says, I'm very thin, flesh mostly vanished, a jumble of bones in a floppy bag of skin. My right side is two deep canyons. To keep myself upright, I lean forward, rest my rib cage on my lap, plant my elbows beside my knees. I am the first generation to survive to such decrepitude. So by her own description, Harriet McBride Johnson suffered from significant impediments as regards bodily thriving. But on the other hand, her meaningful work and her excellence at it, her very ability to handle exchanges with such opponents of the disability rights movement as Peter Singer, her ability to handle exchanges with people like that with intelligence and courtesy and wit, all these things testify to her thriving in mind. There is a general consensus that, other things being equal, thriving in mind outranks bodily thriving. Few people would be willing to trade diminished bodily thriving for comparable diminishments of thriving in mind, and this common attitude seems right. On the scale of value, commonly found in the Christian tradition and also in much contemporary secular thought, the best thing for human beings is a matter of relationship. And if they are serious enough, impediments with regard to thriving in mind are more of a barrier to relationships than roughly comparable impediments to bodily thriving, other things being equal. Furthermore, on the traditional scale of values common in the Christian tradition, the greatest human relationship is with God, and so the greatest thriving for a human person is in that relationship. And even serious impediments to thriving in mind are not a bar to a human person's relationship with God. So consider, for example, the report of a religious experience given by someone who was suffering from major mental illness and confined to a psychiatric hospital. This is what that patient reports. He says, "At one time, I reached utter despair and wept and prayed to God for mercy instinctively and without faith in reply. That night, I stood with other patients in the grounds waiting to be led into our ward. And suddenly, someone stood beside me, and a voice said, 'Mad or sane, you are one of my sheep.' I never spoke to anyone about this, but ever since 20 years, it has been the pivot of my life." And I would say that even among those with both bodily thriving and thriving in mind, few people have such powerful religious experiences. The religious experience this patient reports was so great as to center his life for a long time on his own telling of the story and to bring him consolation throughout that whole period. The closeness to God of his original experience then, and the ongoing relationship with God it provoked, those were great enough to endure through many years of this patient's life. And so even for human beings with serious cognitive impairments, meaningful and fulfilling relationships of love are possible. The philosopher Eva Kate makes this point in a moving passage about her own daughter, who was very seriously disabled, and that passage is worth quoting at length. She says, "Philosophers have made much of the importance of rational capacities for the exercise of moral judgments and moral actions. But many philosophers have seriously understated the critical role other capacities play in our moral life, such as giving care and responding appropriately to care, empathy and fellow feeling, a sense of what is harmonious and loving, and a willingness to reciprocate giving and receiving kindness and love. Consider in this connection a young woman," she's talking about her own daughter, "a young woman whose rational capacities are difficult to determine because she lacks speech, among other skills. But her capacity to enjoy life, to share joy through smiles and laughter, to embrace those who love and care for her, and to bring joy to all whose lives she touches. An individual who through her warmth, her serene and harmonious spirit, and her infectious love of life enriches the lives of others. Whether or not she would know what it means to determine her own good may be in doubt, but the good she brings into the world is not. You can see then that although other things being equal, serious impediments to thriving in mind are more likely to undermine a person's flourishing than comparable impediments to bodily thriving are, flourishing in loving personal relationships is nonetheless possible, even with significant impediments to thriving in mind. Furthermore, as the example of the patient's religious experience illustrates, when God is one of the relata in the relationship, then even those things that might obstruct relationship between two human beings, such as major mental illness, those are not a barrier to relationship where the deity is concerned. An omnipotent, omnipresent God can make relational contact with a human person challenged by a serious impediment to thriving in mind, if only that person does not reject God's love and grace. So what these considerations should help us recognize is that bodily thriving and thriving in mind do not exhaust the modes of thriving that there are for human beings. A human person can have impediments to thriving of both body and mind, and yet that person can have thriving as a human person. So there is thus a third mode of thriving. Harriet Tubman seems to me a good example of this third mode of thriving. She was born a slave, and from early childhood, she was recurrently separated from her family. When she was 6 or 7, for example, she was farmed out to a different household as a house slave and a nanny. In that job, child though she was, she endured severe beatings, and she was often deprived of sufficient food and adequate clothing. Later in life, as a result of the abuse of one slave master, she suffered a serious head wound, which left her with lasting neurological problems. Throughout the rest of her life, she seems to have suffered from narcolepsy and other manifestations of brain damage as a result of that injury. And it's difficult to believe that in addition to the neurological problems she suffered, she didn't also have lasting psychological damage from the trauma of the abuse she suffered as a child. And this is only the beginning. The story of the suffering of her life is too great to be summarized adequately in a short space here. And it's hard to tell, hard to read, even in abbreviated form, because the cruelty inflicted on her is heartbreaking. When she was a young woman, Tubman succeeded in escaping from slavery, and she spent all the rest of her long life rescuing other slaves and working for the abolition of slavery, often in very dangerous circumstances. When a biography of her was being prepared during her lifetime, she asked Frederick Douglass to write a recommendation for the cover of the book. And this is what he wrote to her. He, so worthy of honor himself, he wrote to her, "You ask for what you do not need when you call upon me for a word of commendation. I need such words from you far more than you can need them from me, especially when your superior labors and devotion to the cause of the lately enslaved of our land are known as I know them. I know of no one who has willingly encountered more perils and hardships to serve our enslaved people than you have." The great honor in which Harriet Tubman was and is so rightly held by so many people, me included for sure, that great honor bears witness to her thriving as a human being. She is not a bent or broken or otherwise failing specimen of the human species. On the contrary, she is a shining example of humanity. And we do not honor her out of compassion, as someone who heroically overcame the tragic circumstances of her life. Rather, anyone with integrity has to acknowledge that she sets a standard for human greatness, and so also for thriving as a human being. But she had that thriving with serious impediments to thriving of body and thriving of mind. What the case of Harriet Tubman shows us is that thriving of body and thriving of mind are neither necessary nor sufficient for personal thriving. There is a kind of third mode of thriving too, and it's hard to know what to call it exactly, but I'm calling it personal thriving because it is the thriving of the whole person and not the thriving of just a part of the person, thriving of body or mind. Because it's the thriving of the whole person, personal thriving outranks thriving of either the other two modes of thriving, or even of both of them combined. So human flourishing is not just a matter of thriving in body or in mind or both. It's a matter of thriving as a whole person. And this thriving can occur even when a person suffers from significant impediments as regards both mind and body. As the example of Harriet Tubman illustrates, the depredations of other human beings, the consequences of severe poverty, the misfortunes of nature, and other similar afflictions cannot take away from a sufferer the possibility of flourishing. For even resplendent human flourishing, it is not necessary that the impediments to thriving of mind or thriving of body be prevented or removed. Now, here I want to say clearly, and I hope that you are listening to me. I hope you hear what I'm saying. I recognize, of course I recognize, the troublesome appearance of this claim and the dreadful misuses to which it can be put. Nonetheless, if this claim were not true, then human flourishing would be another monopoly of the wealthy Western industrialized consequences, or at least of the upper classes in those countries. Wealth can go a long way towards the prevention or the amelioration of impediments to the thriving of mind and body through nutrition, medical care, education, and other things of that sort that wealth makes possible. But wealth is neither necessary nor sufficient for human flourishing, and consequently, neither is the thriving of body or the thriving of mind that wealth helps to produce. I want to add loudly and clearly that this claim should be no consolation for those people who cause suffering to others, or whose indifference contributes to the suffering of others, or who fail to remedy the suffering of others when they can readily do so. That flourishing is compatible with suffering does not imply that such people aren't hateful in their conduct. It's hard not to notice that just as the patristic thinkers supposed, some diminishments in thriving of body or mind can in fact be woven into personal thriving. That is, the bodily or mental diminishments in thriving can in fact contribute to personal thriving, not because they constitute challenges that a person surmounts, but because those very diminishments are themselves somehow ingredient in that person's thriving. That is, those diminishments are integral to the thriving in the sense that their removal would contribute to the removal or the lessening of the personal thriving. Harriet Tubman's suffering from the cruelty of the slave society around her and her consequent impairments with regard to both body and mind, they seem to be part of the fabric of her character, marked by her charismatic leadership in her society and her self-sacrificial care for others. Or think of the same point the other way around. How many people who live an upper-class life without much serious suffering, without much of any impairment in mind or body, how many of those people count as having great personal thriving? How many people in a life of ease, with little tribulation in it, seem to be an example of human flourishing that other people would love to be like? On the contrary, greatness of personal thriving seems to be found largely, if not actually exclusively, among those who suffer greatly too. It is difficult to think of anyone who lacks such suffering and yet excites powerful admiration for the personal thriving of his life. That suffering can lead to great personal thriving seems to me overwhelmingly confirmed by evidence of all kinds, including historical reflection, psychological studies, and plausible fictional narratives. But why it should be so is harder to see. On the scale of value for flourishing, which is maintained in Orthodox Christian theology and which is widely held even among those who hold secular views, that scale of value has relationships of love at the heart of human flourishing. But the post-fall human condition is characterized by a tendency to turn away from such relationships of love into a kind of willed loneliness and isolation. And so the post-fall human condition inclines a person in a direction that undermines flourishing when flourishing is understood as a matter of relationships of love. Suffering can make a difference to this condition in varying ways. To begin with, because suffering is generally aversive, we hate it, we want it to go away, it can drive a person to seek help from the suffering, can drive a person to seek amelioration, and that amelioration will have to be sought, at least in part, in the remedies that other people can provide. Or if all remedies fail, then suffering can incline a person to seek just the consolation that other people can give by their presence and compassion. Even when suffering can't be taken away or diminished, it can somehow be made more bearable by the consolation of the presence of loving other people. For one reason or another, then suffering can break in on a person's inwardness and isolation. The aversiveness of suffering can fuel a person's willingness to seek connection with others. A suffering person may turn to other human beings, but it is also widely recognized that in suffering, a person is likely to turn to God, even if this turning comes with anger or complaint, as it does in the case of Job in the biblical book of Job. It is common to find religious belief and religious experience among those in deep distress. It is less common to find true religiosity among those who are at ease. For Harriet Tubman, God was always present to her and engaged with her. One of her biographers describes an experience that was typical for her. It occurred at the time in her life when she was first contemplating returning to slave territory to rescue other slaves. That biographer wrote this about Tubman. The biographer said, she had great fears about her future course, and she confided to the biographer, "The Lord told me to do this. I said, 'Oh Lord, I can't. Don't ask me. Take somebody else.'" But Tubman also reported that God spoke directly to her. "It's you I want," Harriet Tubman. As this and many other anecdotes from Tubman's life illustrate, suffering is part of an ongoing process in a person's life in which flourishing can develop and then increase. The correlation between suffering and flourishing depends on second personal relationships of love, and those relationships are dynamic, not static, even where God is concerned. It's part of traditional Christian theology that God will give grace to anyone who does not refuse it. But clearly, a process of this sort will expand rapidly if it's continued. That's because the grace given enables a person to ameliorate her own inner fragmentation and so to be more willing to be open to love and goodness. And that increased openness on her part will be met with more grace that grows her in internal integration in goodness, thereby resulting in more grace given, and so on. Insofar as suffering opens a person to love and deepens her in closeness to God and others, it's an element in that growth. Certainly, what makes Harriet Tubman exemplary for us increased in her throughout her life. I have no wish to support anything that would seem in any way to make light of Harriet Tubman's suffering. The suffering inflicted on her by the people promoting and maintaining slavery highlights the terribleness of the human post-fall disorder for which no words seem negative enough. Nonetheless, with diffidence, I want to suggest that Harriet Tubman's life also illustrates the complicated thought in the epistle to the Corinthians that I presented earlier, and the traditional Christian attitude towards suffering represented by that quotation from Chrysostom with which I began. On the complex thought in the Pauline epistle, in virtue of suffering, a person can grow in flourishing, even with irremediable and significant impediments to thriving of body or mind, until there is in her life such flourishing that it's right to think of it as glory. Tubman's flourishing came to her in virtue of her suffering, and the result is that her life is an example of the best a human life can be. The connection that the epistle makes between suffering and glory is illustrated in her life. And her life also illustrates the epistle's claim that consolation increases with affliction. That Harriet Tubman is as exceptional in her ongoing religious experience as in her great-heartedness and in her suffering. That's evident not only from her own testimony, but also from the testimony of other people who knew her. Her contemporary biographer summed the matter up this way. The biographer says, Harriet spoke of consulting with God, and she trusted that God would keep her safe. Thomas Garrett once said of her, I never met with any person of any color who had more confidence in the voice of God as spoken direct to her soul. This evaluation of Harriet Tubman's religious life is surely right. At any rate, it's highly doubtful whether any of those in the relatively well-to-do slaveholding communities around her lived in the kind of ongoing, powerful religious experience she had. And so the epistle's correlation of glory and of consolation with suffering seems well illustrated in her life. On this way of thinking of suffering, it's not hard to see why Chrysostom would say that those who suffer more are also especially dear to God. And here it is important to me to highlight what I am not saying, what I am not claiming, and I hope you will listen especially carefully here. I am not claiming that the good of human flourishing justifies any human being in causing or permitting or failing to remedy suffering of the sort Harriet Tubman endured. To say that a person flourishes as she does, at least in part in virtue of her suffering, does not imply that it would be acceptable for another human being to permit that suffering or to cause that suffering or to refuse to remedy that suffering if he could readily do so. It's one thing to claim that some suffering can lead to the flourishing of the sufferer, and another thing entirely to claim that a person is justified in causing or allowing such suffering for the sake of that flourishing. In addition, the consolation that increases with affliction, as the epistle describes it, may not come at the same time as the affliction. It may come only later. It may come only much later. So even those who seem to lack all consolation because they're burdened by major depression or by something else that leaves them destitute of ordinary human peace, they may yet find that their suffering enables them to flourish later with greater peace and greater joy than other people who have not experienced such desolation. Finally, someone may suppose that for every one person such as Harriet Tubman, there are countless others who do not flourish in their suffering. And here what I want to say is that such a claim about the relative proportion of people who suffer without flourishing in consequence, that claim seems to me unsupported by any good evidence, and here is why. Suffering is not always transparent, even to the sufferer, let alone to people around the sufferer. You might think you're completely healthy, for example, when in fact you are suffering from metastasized pancreatic cancer. You just haven't discovered it yet. And flourishing is similarly not transparent either. The lab might have sent you somebody else's test results by mistake, and so you might think that you've got tuberculosis when in fact you're completely healthy. So in this respect, consider Sophie Scholl. She attempted to protest the Nazi evils of her time. but she was caught by the Nazis very fast. They put her through a speedy show trial, and they very quickly executed her. She was 22 years old. She'd accomplished virtually nothing in her life. And the Nazis buried her in an outcast grave at the edge of at the outer edge of what was then Munich. Hardly anybody around the world knew her or cared to know who she was. But now she is honored the world over for her courage and for her willingness to risk her life for the sake of justice in her community. She's honored for the flourishing of her short life, and her grave is never without fresh flowers. So it's possible for a person both to suffer and to flourish in ways invisible to others, at least for a time, at least in this life. But the flourishing is real nonetheless. Consequently, the claim that most sufferers find no flourishing in their suffering is not only unsupported, but in fact, it's such that empirical support for it is in principle hard to come by. So here is what I want to say in conclusion. With all these caveats I've just given underlined, then it seems to me right to acknowledge that there is a connection between the flourishing of the life of a sufferer, such as Harriet Tubman, and the suffering that she endured. It seems to me true to say, with the thought of the Pauline epistle, that Tubman flourished in virtue of her suffering. If there is something heartbreakingly shaming about the human species in consequence of its part in such horrors as the slavery of the antebellum South, then the gloriousness of Tubman's life is highlighted by contrast. With all the impediments as regards mind and body, which were a suffering for her, who would not grant that the flourishing of her life greatly outranked that of the slaveholders whose lives had vastly less suffering than hers, or even greatly outranked the flourishing of those Northerners who lived at ease and were content not to mingle themselves into the troubles of other people? Who would pick one of those Southern slaveholders or one of the indifferent Northerners as exemplary of human flourishing? By contrast with the life of Harriet Tubman, their lives look small or sad or shaming for our species. And if, like the slaveholding Southerners or the uninterested Northerners, Tubman had just lived a life of relative wealth and comfort, it seems very unlikely that she would have become the woman we now are honored to honor. And so there is something deeply right in the traditional Christian attitude about suffering, as there is something deeply right in the disability rights movement. There's something deeply right about that attitude. A person is more than the sum of her mind and body, and there can be a magnificent flourishing of the whole person, not in spite of, but because of the suffering she endures. And with that, I am done. Thank you.
So, Dr. Stump, I wonder if you could say a little bit about how your account might relate or explain the flourishing and suffering of people who might not believe in God. So you very beautifully stress some of the intimacy that someone like Harriet Tubman experienced in her belief, and you talk about this in relationship to Job. So I wonder if you might just offer your reflections on that.
Well, that's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it because, see, here's a question. An atheist is somebody who doesn't believe that God exists. Okay, fine. But it doesn't follow from the atheist belief that from an atheist who believes that he believes God doesn't exist, doesn't follow from his thought about his own condition that he doesn't know God. What you got to ask is, what do you think God is actually? I mean, he's not actually he's not actually the guy who stands at the gates of the country club of heaven and checks your ID. And heaven isn't a place where you go, where the winners go. Heaven is union with the deity. Now, to be united with a deity to whom one can say, you a deity to whom one can use second personal terms of address. To be united with such a deity, you have to love what that deity is, and you have to love what that deity loves. And you could do that even while you were thinking of yourself, I'm an atheist, I don't know if I'm getting into heaven, or I don't care if I get into heaven, I don't believe there is a heaven. You could do those things anyway. Why? Because just think about the story of the prince and the pauper. If you knew the pauper and believed of yourself that you didn't know the prince, if the pauper was the prince in disguise, you would be wrong about who you knew. So because on complicated Thomistic theology, on the Orthodox theology of the great Christian intellectual heritage, God is simple. We say about God both that God is a person to whom you can say you, and that is also simultaneously true that God is goodness, that God is beauty, and so on. If you love goodness and think to yourself you don't believe in God, you don't love God, then you just don't understand the nature of the deity. What you're loving is what the deity is, and so on. Of course, we hope that eventually your love of goodness or your love of beauty or whatever it is will lead you to understand that goodness and beauty are the same as the person who can say you to you. We hope that that's how it goes. But nonetheless, being an atheist is no more transparent than being healthy is, like that. So that's what I would say. And just as somebody who thinks I don't believe in God could be wrong about himself in that sense and grow and grow and grow in closeness to the deity. I mean, in the same way, suffering could have a role in that growth in that person's life. And we have some really marvelous examples that way. There are some marvelous examples that I raised in the Wandering in Darkness book that show you how, in more detail, how that might work. That's the idea.
Great, thank you. So, Liz.
Thank you. Hi, thank you for taking the time to meet with us. The thing that I struggle and grapple with is the Euclidean paradox, which, just to summarize, states if God is all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving, like why does evil exist? Either he can't stop it, so he wouldn't be all-powerful. He doesn't know it exists, so then he wouldn't be all-knowing. Or he knows it exists, he can stop it, but he lets it exist, and then he wouldn't be all-loving. And what I gathered from the thesis statement of your speech essentially was, with magnificent flourishing, or that self-fulfillment comes from suffering in some aspects, and that can be enabled through suffering. However, my question to that then would be, if God is all powerful, he should be able to create a world in which we have absence of evil and suffering, and we still experience all the positive outcomes. And why doesn't he do that?
Well, some of us have written big books on this subject. This is the problem. So, but in a nutshell, maybe I can show it to you like this. Everything depends on what you think human beings are, what you think they're like. And if you think to yourself, yeah, we're pretty nice, pretty good, I would say you're not paying attention. And if you think about, look at the world around you, pick any place, whether you're right wing or left wing or nothing at all, pick any place on the globe and have a look to see what we are. And it's absolutely staggering what human beings will do, not just to other human beings, but to the beasts of the world, to anything, to anything. So here is my example to show you, maybe this will help. When I was raising children, when my children were very small, the medical profession had a conviction, which I hope they have now given up. But at that time, it was universal in the medical profession. If your child has a high fever, here's what you have to do. Strip that child naked, put him in the bathtub, and pour cold water on him. So I had a 2-year-old with a high fever, and the doctor explained this to me for the umpteenth time. So I stripped my little 2-year-old naked and put him in the tub and poured cold water over him with a predictable result. He's screaming, "Mama, Mama," with his arms out to be picked up, for me to stop this, for me to take him in and hold him. I said to my husband, "I'm not doing this. I am not doing this." And you know what? My husband did it. And I want you to ask yourself, which of the two parents was the more loving one? See what I mean? If if you're willing to endure the suffering of what you love for the well-being of that thing, if that little thing is, if the person you love is in some sort of bad condition, some sort of condition that needs something like cold water on a naked, feverish child, and you're willing to put up with giving that suffering for the sake of making sure that that thing flourishes and does not die, then that's love. That's not an absence of omniscience or omnipotence or goodness. It's lovingness.
So what you're saying is by taking on that suffering, you in turn are loving another person, basically, you're taking on suffering so that the positive outcome is achieved, and then that is a gesture of love. Is that correct?
I'm saying this, that human beings are afflicted with the kind of horror of evil that you can see in what was done to Harriet Tubman, so that even my sanitized, abbreviated summary is hard to hear. What kind of entity could do what human beings did to her? Who could do that? And the answer is all of us. All of us. And now, if you were a lover of creatures as evil as we clearly are, what would you do with them? What would you do with them? I mean, one thing you might think to do with them is, I got an idea. Let's annihilate them all and start over. But there's not a whole lot of love in the desire to annihilate your children. And so the Christian tradition has said two things about God and suffering. One is, God is not willing to give up on us, erase us and start over. He wants to redeem us so that out of the condition in which we are, he can call to us and make us fit for joyful, loving relations with each other and with him. But what it takes to do that is going to involve suffering, for sure. You can see it. You don't have to, I mean, you can see it if you look around you. How many really rich people strike you as morally exemplary? Whereas yeah, that's the general idea. Yeah.
Thank you so much. My name is Margot, and I know this isn't really the central thesis of your presentation, but I'm wondering if you could expand more on mental flourishing, mental thriving. I was curious about your sort of two examples of Buzz Aldrin suffering from deep depression, and then the young woman described by her mother who was suffering from severe cognitive impairments. How do you see those two contrastively or similarly? And would you say mental flourishing is more akin to like happiness, or maybe to some sort of intellectual life? Both, neither, something totally different?
Well, if you think about what goes into the mind of a human being, and there's a whole lot of components of it. Language is one component of it. The ability to learn new things is a component of it. Insofar as some of those things are taken away, you've got cognitive impairment, you've got impediments to normal human flourishing of mind, and so on. So that's one kind of impairment of mind. That's the kind that the young woman had, that her mother was describing. Another kind is when you've got perfectly normally functioning intellective equipment, but you've got some sort of disorder that keeps you from having joy in anything, and that's an impairment also. So there's all different sorts of ways in which you can have impairment with regard to thriving of mind, and Buzz Aldrin had one kind, and the young woman had a different kind.
As a sort of follow-up, or maybe better explain my initial question, can you expand more on the young woman? Because the way that I understood it was you seemed to be saying that she was able to mentally flourish, but maybe you're saying that it's impossible.
She was able to flourish as a whole person. She's an example of personal thriving. So she's an example. Her mother presents her as an example of someone who has very significant impairments with regard to mind, but nonetheless who has great personal thriving. And that's why her mother, she brings joy into the lives of other people.
Hello, Professor Stump. Thank you for your talk. My name is Nicholas. One question on personal thriving and thriving the whole person in general. I'm struggling to understand how we can sort of assign this quality of personal thriving to a person if it isn't in virtue of some specific capacity of the person. Or to put it another way, in what sense is it Harriet Tubman thriving if it's not related to some capacity of Harriet Tubman? The function or dysfunction thereof.
Well, of course, the personal thriving of Harriet Tubman comes in consequence of the parts of her that do what they do. So, she's got a body and the body works in the ways it does. She's got a mind, the mind works in the way it does. She has an emotional condition that works in the way it does. But a person is more than the sum of her parts. That's what I want to say. I mean, even a water molecule is more than the sum of its parts, you might say. So the whole person can't be reduced to the parts that make her up. Think of the water molecule and you'll see the general point. So there's 2 hydrogen, 1 oxygen, but the whole water molecule can form a hydrogen bond and the oxygen can't and the hydrogen can't. So a whole can have capacities and the whole can have properties which are not the properties of individual parts of it. And it's a basic anti-reductionistic position that transposes that general anti-reductionist thought to persons as well as water molecules.
So if suffering is practically necessary to promote pursuit of relationships of love, then doesn't it? Well, might it follow that a society that is devoted to the abolition of suffering is one that is going to lack in personal thriving?
No, see, that's the thing I was trying to say at the very end. You can think about it this way. Suppose that you have somebody you love who has leukemia and is going to die, and the doctor says, no, don't go so fast. We've got terrific therapies now for leukemia, and we'll try chemotherapy. If that doesn't work, we'll try immunotherapy and so on. And you start researching and you realize chemotherapy drugs are really poison. They're poison. And so you get the idea, I got a great idea. Poison makes people healthy. I've learned this from my friend with leukemia. The doctors told me this. Poison makes people better. I'm going to make everybody better. I'm going to give poison to all the people I care about. Okay, now we know that you're just not paying attention. You lack the kind of knowledge and skill to know how to administer poison in such a way that makes anybody better. You're administering the poison shows just that you're arrogating to yourself an erudition, a skill that you don't in fact have, if in fact it's as good as that. Because otherwise, what we generally think is when you try to make somebody better by suffering, often enough, what's at issue in you is not a desire for their well-being, but malice and pleasure in someone else's suffering. So that we want to be very, very careful about how we think there's any suffering may be good, but your administering of it may have very little that's good about it.
So yeah, the question is about suffering, and in the case like dogmas, it seemed to me that there was something like meaningful suffering involved, suffering that led to something of value, a connection to God, virtue, and so on. But I was thinking, many cases of suffering is not meaningful in this way, isn't it? In the sense that maybe suffering leads to either nothing of value or the opposite of something of value. After all, many people who suffer in very similar circumstances as dogmas either they just suffer without seeing something like this kind of like cause that Atonement took on, or participating in it, or connecting to God. Some might even have internalized their suffering and oppression and see that, well, they better side with the oppressor and rather than with their own people. And so this kind of suffering doesn't seem meaningful in some way. But so were these people flourishing? What happened in those cases and so on?
That's a great question. All these questions have been excellent. I've been very glad of all of them. I especially like this question. That is completely right. So there's nothing about suffering that guarantees it will contribute to your flourishing. You have to react to it in a certain way. So that's the first thing to see. It's not a magic potion. It's more nearly like an invitation. And secondly, the consolation or the growth or whatever it might be may not come at the time of the suffering. It may take a long time to come later. My favorite example of this is in the work of John Bunyan, Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. So he lived in a time when you could be really just spectacularly uneducated in a way that I think we virtually never see. And in that uneducated state, when he was still a very, very young man, he learned about the unforgivable sin that would damn you to hell forever. And he didn't know what it was. And he got increasingly worried about it. And he worried and he worried. And finally, he just couldn't stand the anxiety anymore. And he sat bolt upright in bed in the middle of the night and said, "Okay, God, I'm doing it. I am now committing the unforgivable sin." And then he spent, I don't know, another 20 years of his life convinced he was going to hell because he'd committed the unforgivable sin. Later in life, he wrote this magnificent book called Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners, and it's written on two levels. He shows you what it was like to be him, to live every day thinking he was going to burn in hell for forever because he committed the unforgivable sin, thinking that God hated him, that God was keeping any help or consolation from him. He shows you what it was like to live like that, what he did, what he said, what he thought, what he suffered in that horrible depression. And at the same time, he shows you all the different ways in which God was trying to convince him that he was completely wrong about the entire situation. All the different ways in which God was providing help and consolation to him, which he couldn't recognize at the time. He lived in that terrible condition for I don't know how many years, maybe 20. It was a long time. When he came out the other side, he started as a basically totally uneducated, super lower class person in a class conscious society. When he came out the other end of that, he was a power to be reckoned with. His views, his practices were illegal in England, but they were practices and beliefs he felt God was requiring of him. At a certain point, the educated, aristocratic, rich folks called him before a council to determine what he should be punished for and so on, what to do to him. And the smartest person on the highly educated, super rich, upper class folks in the council said to the other guys on the council, "Don't ask him any more questions. Don't ask him any more questions. Don't give him a chance to talk," because he was making mincemeat of all those people. and doing it, with a kind of what do I want to say? Steadfastness, a kind of unshakability. They couldn't rattle him. He knew what he was doing. But that came way, way after, way, way after. In that earlier period, all he thought was he was going to hell for forever. So what's powerful about a case like that is it shows you that even somebody who looks as if he's completely destitute of any kind of good coming out of his suffering may nonetheless, unknown to you, be getting great good from it. So Bunyan has become one of the great heroes, one of the great people of the Christian intellectual heritage. There's his most well-known work, Pilgrim's Progress, but there's a lot of other works that he wrote too that are really impressive And grace abounding to the chief of sinners is one of my favorite, for sure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stump. So I've been trying to think through some of these things from kind of a dual perspective of Aquinas' metaphysics of creation and a phenomenology of resentment as regards to suffering, flourishing. And so there's kind of a long argument, but I try to make it very crisp and like to put the essentials of the argument in front of you and ask if it generally makes sense or not, and if it doesn't, correct me. If it does, maybe point me towards either some of your writings or text in Aquinas or anywhere else where I could kind of go a little deeper in the thinking. So on the doctrine of creation from nothing, all contingent being is gift, right? So like the little flower is the idea that everything is grace, everything is gift. Furthermore, all created being as contingent is necessarily finite. Furthermore, because human being, I'm thinking of like St. Augustine's Kotbach's Day and C.S. Lewis's argument from desire, we desire the infinite automatically. But because we are finite, limited, contingent beings, it seems that suffering is inherent in contingent being metaphysically. And
I can stop here right there. That's the place where I'm going to disagree. I don't think Aquinas thinks that. I certainly don't think that. I don't think that's right at all. I think creation bringing something out of nothing brings only goodness with it. In order to get something that has suffering, you first got to get something capable of hatred, capable of malice, capable of evil. And at that point, you don't have to get that hatred or the evil, but you can. And if you do, that's when the problem begins. That's when the problem begins. And at that point, there's a variety of things God could do. You know, he could wipe everything out and start over. He could take away free will from his creatures and just make them do what he wants them to do and turn them into puppets. He could do a lot of stuff, but on none of those systems would he have anything he wants, because what he wants is you. That's what he wants. He wants you. And for that, he has to try to find some way to work with you so that you are willing to let him fix what is deviant, what is disordered, what is fundamentally cruel in you. And suffering will be an ingredient in that process, no matter what. Not least because, think about it this way, who doesn't want to be loved? Nobody. Everybody wants to be loved. And so, in theory anyway, everybody wants to come to a loving God and enter into some sort of loving relation. But as we know from ordinary human relations, people who love and want to be loved also often enough don't want to be loved. They don't want to be seen. They don't want to make a commitment, as we say. And why is that? We all know why that is. We all know why that is. It's very risky to allow yourself to be loved. It's very risky to allow yourself to love somebody else. And some people find that risk harder than other people. But that's why any kind of healing from the thing that afflicts us as human beings is going to carry suffering with it, even if it doesn't involve slavery or anything of that sort. Just the very process of letting go of the parts we don't want to let go of is going to be painful.
Thank you. Well, please join me in thanking Dr. Stump.
Thank you for coming. And I want you to know, I thought every one of those questions was terrific. Every one of them was just the right question to ask after this lecture. And I enjoyed being with you, enjoyed hearing your questions. And I hope that you keep asking Father Tucker to answer them.